Thank you so much for that introduction, and it's such a pleasure to be here. And thank you for venturing out here on this cold day. And of course, when I was coming here, there were warnings of snowstorms, and so you're very brave to come here. So you're courageous to be here. You're fearless to come here on a day like today. So yes, so when I met Anilji and for a conversation, when he offered me to do one of these sessions, he gave me a list of topics that I could work with. And I chose fearlessness because when I look back at my own life too, there's been a lot of fear, and I've done a lot of work to overcome those fears. I grew up in Sri Lanka in a beautiful village called Gandhi, and both my parents were teachers. They were the most humble, generous people around. My mother was a Montessori school teacher, my father was a teacher and a philosopher and a pacifist. And I grew up in a home where they never lifted a finger on me or my sisters. The fingers were lifted on me by my teachers. So I grew up in a village called Gandhi, and I'll share with you some of those stories as I move on. But this topic right now is so relevant for us, given the current world situation and the existential problems that we are facing in the world right now. And those problems we cannot ignore. None of us here can ignore anymore, especially right now with what's happening in the south of the country too, where there's a threat of an invasion. There are other threats that are coming at us from various areas, including climate change. So how do we stay grounded through all this without going to a place of fear? And that is what I want to share with you today. So in terms of becoming fearless, one of the other things is coming into community, because the world is fragmented right now, as you know. It's dysfunctional, there's dystopia right now. So what I want to do is to go back in history to see why we are here. Think critically about the root causes as to why we are facing what we are facing today in this existential crisis that is coming at us. And to go to those root causes, we need to think back into the history of the world. We have to look at philosophies that have shaped the world. We have to look at the science, technologies that are coming at us. So there's a whole range of issues that I want to cover today in this presentation. But I want to first start with me, because at the end of the day, we have been trained to look for solutions outside us. But Mahatma Gandhi, who came into my consciousness since I was a kid, has given us some wonderful lessons in becoming fearless through adversity. And that consciousness came from the fact that both my parents, as they were intellectuals, they had books. So one of the first books I read as a teenager was Mahatma Gandhi's biography. And that was a powerful story there for us. And that consciousness, that has been in my conscious mind for a lifetime. Because I was also keenly interested in leadership, and we were politically quite aware, because my father was quite aware politically too, so we heard these stories around the dinner table. I was also I had a keen interest in leadership and politics. So people like John F. Kennedy played a big role in understanding what's going on in the world. I remember going with my father every 2 weeks or so to the British Council Library and to the USIS Library in Kandy to look at the newsreels. And I remember vividly, a few days after, or a few months after, it must have been shown to us, a newsreel where John F. Kennedy's cortege was was going in a procession, and his young son doing a salute as a 3-year-old as the body of John F. Kennedy was being led. And that also had a profound impact on me, and I was curious about who John F. Kennedy was. And along those lines, there were so many other leaders that I had a deep inquiry. I started reading those autobiographies and stories, and another person I was quite interested in was Hitler. And luckily I found a book in my father's library by his architect called Albert Speer. Albert Speer was not a Nazi ideologue, but he was his architect. So he had a kind of a objective point of view of how Hitler evolved and what he did. Albert Speer cared about the buildings and design, which Hitler wanted to build as monuments. But his story also of Hitler was very informative of how a human being can go to the other extreme of nastiness. And how can we exist in our society knowing that a fellow human being can go to those levels. So in my life too, I've been fortunate to have encountered people who have lived with unconditional love. Many of them are Buddhist monks, so I come from a Buddhist tradition, a Vedic tradition, but I was also influenced by Christianity and Catholicism because I grew up and went to a Catholic school. So having had these influences, I've had the opportunity to be with incredibly wise, loving, kind individuals. Some of them are Buddhist monks, some of them are Catholic priests, who come across with unconditional love. And at the same time, I've also had the opportunity to meet some of the most nastiest human beings too, having lived through a war in Sri Lanka too. So to realize that you and I here are capable of the vilest of behavior, because that's another fellow human being, and that we're also capable of unconditional love on the other side too, has been an interesting inquiry for me in my lifetime. So just to start off, I was brought up in a village just outside the beautiful hill town of Kandy. And I know somebody else who's here from Kandy. Yes, Rajesh. Yes.
Can we go there now?
You can, yes. Yes. So there's a temple of truth there. So it's a very sacred place. It's in the hill. It's nestled amongst the hills of Sri Lanka. And I grew up in a village about 2 miles from there called Siamalagastenda, which was a self-contained, beautiful little village with a strong Catholic influences. There was a St. Anthony's Church at the bottom of this road, the top of the road. There was a Carmelite convent at the bottom of the road. And then the area was nestled by about 100 acres of a school that I went to called St. Anthony's College. And within that community, there was a patriarch and a matriarch, and then there were beautiful rice paddy fields, and the big house was owned by the patriarch and the matriarch of the community, and then we lived next door to it. So I was really brought up by this village. And my parents both being teachers, my mother being a Montessori school teacher, she had all the Montessori equipment at home, but she didn't put me to a nursery school or a kindergarten. She said, no, nature is out there. So I was mostly barefoot roaming around this village from the time I was about 4 years old. So I was told 2 things not to do: not to get into the river, not to go across the railway crossing, are the 3 things: not to talk to strangers. So these influences that came from also a multicultural community that lived in that neighborhood, from Buddhists to Hindus to Christians to Muslims, and from different backgrounds. So it gave me a very rich foundation to live among diversity. So that foundation also gave me a sense of grounding. However, I was very curious about this. Even though my parents were gentle human beings, I grew up with a certain as I got a little older, 5, 6, 7 years old, I felt that I had an aggression within me. There was something that's trying to come out and I then ended up being quite an incorrigible kid too. I wanted my own way all the time, and I had to give a price to my parents for putting up with me, because I was the eldest and I have 2 sisters. But I was wondering where that aggression came from. And when I think back too, because I used to roam around, I used to hang around with a lot of people. There were a lot of older boys that I used to go and hang around with, and we also had domestic help at home, so our parents would leave them with them. So there must have been something that happened to me at a very young age that I cannot quite remember that sent me into that place of aggression. And also, there were a bunch of fears that I had, and I was afraid of the dark. I was afraid of ghosts. I wouldn't go near a cemetery. I just would. So all of those fears that I had, also I couldn't quite figure out where they came from. And as I grew older, so this is my family. As I grew older, I started working on that, because at 12, was a watershed period for me, the age of 12. So that's my mother and father and my 2 sisters, and that's my grandmother, who was an incredible mentor and a guide for me. She was a pillar of strength for me. And that's Bongzu, our little dog. So 12 was a watershed year for me for a couple of reasons. In 1971, the first insurgency happened in Sri Lanka, where a bunch of university students who were not happy with the class divide attacked 108 police stations one morning on April 5th in tandem. And that was the loss of my innocence. Because until then, I would say I had a fairly nice, idyllic, free life there. And for the first time, we had curfews. And I remember sitting there and listening to the radio, and my father was explaining this to me as to what had happened. Why would people pick up these guns and go and attack these 108 police stations? There must have been something wrong for them to do that. So those discussions then, I was really curious about it. And that's when my father started explaining to me the cultural, the social divides that we had between the Anglicized Sri Lankans, the English-speaking Sri Lankans who had opportunities, versus the rural youth who were going through the university system, and they were not allowed to break through the glass ceiling into mainstream jobs and all that. So they knew about the world, they knew about history, so their movement was called the Che Guevara movement. And it evolved, it raised its ugly head in time, but when I say ugly, I put that word in inverted commas, because they really had reason to raise their head because of the hopelessness they felt. And the rest, the elite of the country really did not know. So that, for me, was a turning point in my life to try to understand what's going on. And it was a fearful time for us, because of curfews. We were not allowed to even go on the streets, and army was asked to shoot at sight anybody roaming around. And then after a few days, when the curfews ended, I remember a boy running and telling us, "Hey, there's a dead body in the river." And I, like a fool, ran there. And to see, sadly, it was a police officer who was bloated, and I wished I didn't go there to see that. And I felt sick after that, and I had nightmares after that, and it really took my innocence away to see that body. It's not as if we were not exposed to death and funerals growing up. It was a part of our life. We were taken to funerals, but seeing that body in that form really affected me. And that was the same time that I was going to Sunday school, and there was a temple near our house, a Buddhist temple. I was now being taught the fundamentals of the Buddhist principles. And those fundamentals, the foundational teachings, started from life is suffering and unsatisfying in its material realm. Was the first dukkha was the first tenet that I was taught by this monk. And the next one is life is uncertain and impermanent. So this education, I feel, was one of the best things that happened to me to set the stage for the rest of my life. Because understanding this then gave me a realization that really there's nothing that's perfect out there. That things can be not as good as that I would wish, because there are certain things that's beyond control for us. And this one, there is no such thing as self, was a very difficult concept to understand for a 12-year-old. And it has taken me a lifetime to figure that out, actually. And at the same time, now in this modern world, so now I work with organizations and businesses, we have now accepted the fact that this is the case here. Because the Western world essentially pretended that everything was perfect. We can find perfection. And that's how we come up with slogans like zero climate change, zero carbon, zero COVID, because that's a very logical, rational statement to accept things to go down to zero, right? So when we realize that everything is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, and this came from the armed forces training, and I know Paul Mellett is here as an armed forces former army man here. So no matter what kind of training you had, once you go to the battlefield, you're on your own. Everything's volatile, everything's uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I'm so glad that now the modern world is beginning to accept this fact, because what happens is when we try to find perfection, we divide ourselves. Right? We then create those expectations that we can have perfection, that we can fix something, we can have an engineering solution for something that possibly does not have a solution like that, because these are not easy problems to solve. These are actually predicaments. So when I look at also the Gandhian philosophy of what Mahatma Gandhi did was to respond to a situation that was really a predicament, right? I mean, if you look at the amount of power that colonial Britain would have had over the people of India and Sri Lanka and the other countries that they ruled, and they ruled those countries with the gun, right? The power of the gun. And to have the ability the grounding, to be able to take that on, is to also understand life and its nature at its core. And that's what's profound from the Gandhian teachings too, right? So from then, if there is suffering, one of the things that I was also taught was, from that place, there has to also be happiness and joy, that we might be able to find that happiness and joy. So suffering exists, and it has a cause and it has an end. And the cause that was taught me at the time was that attachment brings suffering. If you look at everything that is fleeting in life, when we are attached to anything, that can bring us suffering. So we know that when we look at what's happening in the world out there right now, with the elite running the world, with the power that they have, to the wealth that they have, and if you inquire into that, you realize that what they're doing also in meeting out their power, the kind of policies that are now coming out in terms of surveillance, in terms of control that is coming out right now, is also based on fear, right? Because they, like all of us, we don't want to lose things that we have. But they have so much more to lose. So their fears are even greater. So you can really see on the other side of the coin of how that attachment to that power that they have, the wealth that they have, one of the ways that they're protecting themselves is by ring fencing themselves and creating policies that potentially subjugate the rest of the people, so they can control the people, control the rest of the people so they can continue to have power. So that's that attachment that is bringing them suffering, and we can see the root cause of that is fear, right? And then one of the other things that I was taught was that there is a path called the Noble Eightfold Pathway based on 8 practices, starting with right mindfulness. So right concentration and mindfulness was one of the antidotes to deal with our suffering. So that for me was a profound teaching. And that Buddhist monk one day also lined us up one day, one morning, and guided us through a meditation where I really felt my body going into a place of calm. As a 12-year-old, my body into a place of calm. So I used to see my father meditating, so they decided to take on that practice. And that has been one of my saviors, I would say, in working through that aggression that I had, working through the fears that I have had over the years, and it's been a lifetime practice. So it is also a practice that spiritually grounds us, but it is not like a switch that you can put on and off in the machine universe that we have been accustomed to, we have been acculturated to, we have been conditioned to. So it's a practice, it's a long-term practice. So this is what I want to really found this discussion on for the rest of the time. So it comes through the mindfulness lens. It comes through the ancient practices coming from the Vedic Harappan civilization and Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist practices. But it is also now validated through science, and that's what's really exciting about it. And we have both here who's an expert in all this too. So neuroscience, the modern neuroscience is now validating these practices. And this fusion of science and these ancient practices may be one way that we can come out of the predicaments, the existential problems that we are facing right now. Right? So what I invite you to do is to make it real for you by taking this on as a little bit of a practice before we start. All right. So I invite you to close your eyes for a moment. Invite you to take a deep breath and say, observe to yourself. And as you breathe out, just feel the calmness coming over you. Just keep that going for a few moments. Breathing in with awareness, saying observe, and then breathing out. Now I invite you to see whether you can pinpoint an emotion, a thought, a feeling that may have been percolating in your mind as I was setting the stage for this discussion. Can you pinpoint that? Can you define that? And keep that in mind. But as you keep this in-breath and out-breath going, what you're also doing is you're shutting the past and shutting the future, and you're becoming present to the here and now. And the concentration that you're now having is what we're talking about as one of the Eightfold Pathways in focusing your attention so you don't get distracted, so you can put things in perspective. And that's part of the practice. So now I invite you to open your eyes and just reflect for a moment on how that felt on your mind and your body. Did you go into a calmer place by doing that for a moment? So that is part of the right mindfulness, right concentration, right mindfulness, and right effort. And then from there, we get to a place of right understanding. So one of the things that I was also taught at a very practical level when that monk guided me through that meditation was to imagine where that breath was coming from. A tree, the soil, the ocean, and then also to say where my out-breath is going to. So there immediately I was given an understanding of my interconnected nature. I am nature, I'm part of nature, I'm one with nature. So that is another important lesson that came to me through this practice, this being one with nature. And that understanding is then would lead us to, in terms of right livelihood, right action. So it was a nice, very robust, very elegant guide to live by. And of course, it has taken me a lifetime to even get near that, right? Because life is not perfect, right? Because there are so many other challenges that come our way as we live our life. So I just wanted to set the foundation like this, in this way. However, what I also liked was the fact that in the teaching, it said, look, don't take my word for it. It said, think critically about all this. Make it your own practice. So there's no dogma involved in this. There's no ideology involved in this. It gave us the freedom to learn in our own way through our own practice and our own inquiry. So that gives us an opportunity to really think freely and to learn freely. So this is the foundation of practice that I just wanted to share with you in how I shape my life. And then now I want to move on to the next session now and start off with this statement which says, truth is dead, long live honesty. Truth is now being manipulated in different ways, right? We can see that finally, even when it comes to artificial intelligence, we don't know what the truth is anymore. And truth is being manipulated by those who are in power, who have a vested interest, who want to control humanity. But there's one thing still that remains that is within us, and it's honesty. And honesty is something that is then a part of our personal practice that it points to the fact that we need to then move forward with honesty, and that becomes our personal responsibility. And in the next statement, ethics are dead, long live morality. If we look at right now in the news cycles of how the ethical values are being compromised in the name of profit, in the name of power, in the name of greed, we're seeing it in Technicolor. We're seeing mad men running around, killing people, innocent people, for land, for greed. And it is mindless in what we're seeing right now. But we have still morality within us. We have a moral compass within us that we can work with. And how do we then make that happen at an individual level? So this is where I said, we're going to start with our personal well-being first, personal practice first, myself, the relationship that I have within myself, the intrapersonal relationship. And in the presentation, then I'm going to expand to the world out there. So it's me first, then us as a community, and then the world out there. And the world out there then contains the history of the world, the philosophy of how all of these things happen, the root causes of all this, as I said earlier, and how can we then come to terms with it and see whether we can find our way out of these predicaments that we are facing right now. And some of these predicaments are beyond our control because of climate also. But there are other predicaments in terms of our relationships, in terms of the way we govern ourselves that can change with a political will. But it'll only change through conversations like this, us coming together. Because what has happened in the modern world is us being isolated, us being sent to a lonely place based on individualism, and encouraging us to sit in front of a computer, sit in front of a screen where there's dialogue that could happen is being denied to us as a result of that. So how can we then create the systems, create the processes to continue these kinds of conversations? And this actually I attribute to John Reardon, a friend of ours. I'm part of a group called the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, and Paul Mallet, who's here. We are members of a group called the Values Group, where we now push boundaries in trying to ask these difficult questions amongst ourselves and moving forward. So John and Gabriel Agrafenas and Paul, we are part of this group where we continue to meet together to explore these ideas and to see how we can then come up with some answers to move forward. So I want to also now just bring our attention to this. It is now 89 seconds to midnight. Have you heard of the doomsday clock? Yeah. Doomsday clock. So there's only 89 seconds to midnight now. We are in bad shape on this earth right now. And we have to wake up for it. Wake up to it. So the doomsday clock was established in 1947 after World War II, when the nuclear bomb was brought out. And then as the nuclear race began in the Cold War, this clock was set at 7 minutes to midnight. Then next time around, when the crisis, the Bay of Pigs invasion happened, and the big crisis between Soviet Union and United States happened with the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1962, where the threat became real again. It went down to 2 minutes. And now in that scenario, John F. Kennedy was the president of the US and Khrushchev was in the USSR. And they were being egged on by the hawks of war, their generals, to go ahead and press the button. But luckily, sanity prevailed between these two human beings in their common humanity. But there were people like Curtis LeMay. I don't know whether you've heard of that name, Curtis LeMay. Curtis LeMay was one of the U.S. Air Force pilots who just thrived in going and bombing innocent people. He boasted about how he bombed out Dresden in World War II and killing innocent people. And he was one of JFK's advisors who was egging him on. Come on, don't be a coward, you gotta go for it. Press the button, let's fight, let's start the fight. That was going on. But luckily, John F. Kennedy and Khrushchev found a backroom channel to exchange letters. And in those letters, if you read them, we find that both of them found their common humanity. So there was a letter written by John F. Kennedy while it was coming really close now, while he was at Hyannisport in his holiday home, and he then reflected on the beauty of nature that might get destroyed when this bomb goes off, along with all of us. And luckily, Khrushchev was in his dacha outside Moscow, in his backyard, looking at the beautiful scenery. And he also realized, yes, what are we doing to ourselves? And we have the power to do this. And to the dismay of the war hawks, they came to an agreement, and the showdown ended. Right? So so the possibility of this between two people who thought in a sane manner, who got away from the egoistic battle between two men to find that common humanity. So it's possible. Right? So it went down to 2 minutes. But in 1991, when the Cold War ended, when Gorbachev, I consider Gorbachev a hero because he could have still kept on going. He could have still be irrational and kept the fight going between the two worlds. But he decided no point. So he, in my eyes, is a hero because he gave the power up and stopped the Cold War. Now, even in places like South Africa, I look at when Mandela came into power, F.W. de Klerk, who gave up power, again, he could have still continued on without giving up power. And we have seen people like Robert Mugabe who didn't give up power. He didn't know the measure of his, and he hurt so many people, measure of the end of his time. So we have these people who gave up power, and that's the time when the Cold War ended, it went up to 17 minutes. But now, it's 89 seconds to midnight. And last year, it was 90 seconds, so we've lost a second right now. So the nuclear threat is the biggest threat that we have, and of course climate change threat, and there are other threats of potential pandemics and all that add to this crisis that we're facing now. So what I want to do is to invite you all to have a conversation amongst yourselves first now. Give you an opportunity to think about this and have an open conversation, to come together to see whether you can find some common ground. So I invite you to stand up if you don't mind. Otherwise you're going to get rooted in your seat and fall asleep on me, right? And then look around and see somebody, look at somebody who you don't know, and please join them for a conversation just to chat about this predicament that I talked about in terms of where we are at right now, 89 seconds to midnight. How does that feel? What's going on in your mind? Do you have hope? Do you think we can save ourselves? Or is it going to be Armageddon at the end of the day? Right? So please look around, and I'm going to give you, say, 10 minutes to have a nice conversation amongst you all. So it can be 2-3 people together, it can be 4 people together. Get to know each other and enjoy their conversation.
I think to continue with what
Nice.
you were saying. To continue with what you were saying, that in order to stop that evil, we need to start with ourselves. It's always to begin with ourselves, our little contribution. And you spoke about honesty, right? So starting with that, we can change. We can hope for starting with ourselves.
Thank you. And that's the theme of this. How do we start with ourselves? Anybody else?
This 89 seconds to midnight is for me, it's a very scary thought. And if the button is in the hand of a crazy man who only thinks of himself in the sense that he is always right, any provocation to him could be dangerous in that moment. So the people around him, they are scary, they're scared to provoke him. And that's a big danger to the world. Even though the story that you narrated of Kennedy and Khrushchev, they both thought, are we going to destroy this beauty? I'm sure he also loves beauty somewhere, and that is the only thing which will keep him going. But he is so narcissist that any provocation can push him on the other side. So that's a scary thought.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Building on that thought that Milan talked about is the aspect that the leadership that we have in this world, if we were to just objectively look at the 5-6 leaders in the world, and not being political or not being biased or anything, but if we were to imagine national leaders, just in their place, extreme thoughts that like mentality, the world would be a different place. If you just took out the 5 leaders and thought someone else, it could just be a different place. Leaders matter. We can be fearless there to an extent by just being it starts with your own, but then there's a greater practical aspect that leaders will influence the nation, its people, and how it shapes the world. So it is of paramount importance who we choose as a leader, and what qualities they bring, and how they influence the everyday life. And that is sort of the very practical aspect of where things stand today. in our country.
Absolutely. So the values of the leaders and how enlightened they are in understanding the nature of life, right? Right now we have, and I don't even call them leaders, these are people who are in power right now, who are indulging in their power for short-term gain. So there's greed there's delusion, there's a lot of hatred, and that power, they're holding on to that power, and there's fear at the end of that in terms of a root cause, right? So I think that's one of the biggest issues that we're facing. And these people in power do not understand history, philosophy, and has a very shallow way of looking at the world right now in a very transactional, profit-loss kind of way. Right? That's what we're seeing right now. And imagine the leader of the free world, so-called free world, looks at real estate looks at Gaza as a piece of real estate that can be turned into a Riviera of the East, without thinking about the soul of the people, without thinking about the spirit of the people. So that kind of callousness is what we're seeing right now, which is what you're talking about in terms of the dangers that we face in something like this going wrong, right? So, Paul, I know you come from Paul Mallet is a former armed forces person, now in the world of peace. So, any thoughts from you?
Well, maybe just a few. I mean, we had a nice chat, and I think in the absence of the fact that many things in this world are out of our control, for a house person or whatever, but what is in control for all of us, 100%, is how we respond to it. And if we can respond from a position of kindness, that is something. Certainly within all of us, and even Trump and everyone else, all possibilities exist. There's good people in there. I think even Hitler loved his dog, kind of thing. So it's all in there. We have this terrible capacity to compartmentalize things. So it's a question of what unfolds. And then it's a question of can we influence in any way what unfolds, all of these possibilities. So at any given moment, each of us is just a collection of wonderful probabilities and possibilities. When we make a choice, it's an act of creation, and the world changes in some way.
Thank you, Paul. Anybody else? Yes, any thoughts? How about you? Martin? David? Okay. All right. Good. So what I would like to also say to you is at any time, please feel free to pipe in and say, I've got something to say. I agree with what you're saying. I don't agree with what you're saying, because I want to create this space to have an open dialogue here. Because what I'm presenting to you here comes from my awareness, my knowledge, which may not be 100% right. So how do we find common ground by acknowledging that too, and having humility to how we see the world? So central to this theme is the nuclear bomb, right, and nuclear threat right now. And when the United States ended up making the nuclear bomb, they were going against a threat of Nazi Germany and Hitler making the bomb first. So this race then, if you say, and I've also read the Bhagavad Gita several times, and I understand that there's the righteous battles that we have to have too, right? So that race then created the nuclear bomb. And if you look at the nuclear bomb too, it's a fission pulling apart that creates the energy. Right? It's breaking off that atom into two that creates that incredible force and energy. So it's really antithetical to what's good in life, which is a fusion, right? Which is, so the beautiful life that we create comes from two people coming together in fusion, right? In trust, in becoming vulnerable. So that's for me a nice metaphor to see how when things get separated, things can get destroyed. When we come together in fusion, then we can then build things and grow things together. Right? So in terms of the nuclear bomb itself, I believe the United States had an opportunity after the end of the war to lock it up and say, okay, we're going to put it away, and we're going to now see how we can work well together as a common humanity. But instead they didn't. Unfortunately, President Truman, who came into power immediately, had a disliking for Soviet Russia, and the enmity continued. And that's what then forced Russia also to build a nuclear bomb. And we know that if one country has a nuclear bomb, so many others will get access to the technology. And this is what we're seeing right now, right? Pakistan, India, Iran, Israel, they all have nuclear capabilities. And in the hands of them, it's then we are vulnerable to, as Rajesh, you said, to the people who hold the power, to the key there, whether they're going to use it or not, right? And I remember in Sri Lanka where when I did the solar energy business, my business partner was President Jayawardene's grandson. And it was a time of trouble in the country with violence from the insurgency, and just before the war started too. And he had a detail, a bodyguard that was supposed to go with him because he was under threat because he was the grandson of the president. And he sometimes carried a gun. And my cousin and I, who were his business partners, were also offered a gun. And he said, we'll train you. You better carry it because you're traveling around the country in rural areas, in nighttime and daytime, and that you might be under threat. And there were real threats there. And both my cousin and I refused that gun because we thought, no, if something happens, it'll happen. But having that gun will be too tempting for me because living and driving in Sri Lanka, not so different from India. There's a lot of road rage that can happen, buses on your side of the road, around a corner. And I've had that kind of road rage. And if I had a gun, I could have easily gone out of control. So this is what I'm talking about. Unfortunately for humanity, this technology was kept alive, reversed to how we should have had it. Kept it alive to say that, okay, now that I have the gun, we'll make sure that nobody will fight with each other. And I think that was, in my opinion, that's convoluted thinking. And this is what Gandhiji had to say about it. And the man who developed the weapon, Oppenheimer, actually quoted the Gita, I think, and said that I am now the destroyer. And he died a broken man at the end because he felt that he created this monster that now he's left up to the people to manage now. And he felt really, really uncomfortable about that. So I am inspired by Mahatma Gandhi for many reasons. As I said, he's been in my conscious awareness for a lifetime. And I've read many other books, many other stories about him. And one of the incredible sort of attributes of him is his humility and his fearlessness comes also, with that comes a sense of humor. So I thought this was quite funny to read this. When he went to England to negotiate with the colonial, for independence for India, when he went to London, as he went to Buckingham Palace to meet the king at the time, one of the dignitaries there said, Mr. Gandhi, you don't seem to have many clothes on your body. And then he retorted by saying, well, His Majesty is wearing enough clothes for the two of us. And there were many, many quips like that that showed his fearlessness in many ways. He was not daunted by what was deemed to be the colonial masters who deemed to be having so much power over it. So my theme is going to be also in terms of the two different cultures that we have lived with in the world, the Eastern and the Western culture. We separate it superficially, but that is the way the world has evolved with the industrialized world and the developing world in these two tracks. And what Mahatma Gandhi did was to really append that, and somebody like Winston Churchill basically looking down on him from a superiority status said things like half-naked fakir, right? So these are terms that were used to denigrate, but without realizing the power that Mahatma Gandhi brought into the situation to without shedding any blood to gain independence for India. And I know Sri Lanka came right behind it, and Sri Lanka was also able to attain independence without shedding blood through that example. And I just finished reading a book by President Jayawardena, who went through this process with Prime Minister Nehru, and he met Mahatma Gandhi several times too. In his own biography, he has written how Sri Lanka followed India in that independence process. But it was really quite different to the Western mind at the time, the colonist mind. The word satyagraha, sarvodaya, and swadeshi, satyagraha, the truth of nature, truth of life, and sarvodaya, self, that we can help ourselves. And swadeshi is, for those of you who don't know, swadeshi is to be able to create an economy by producing what we need within our own nation. So, New Chronicle in 1942 in England talked about, to our Western minds, Mr. Gandhi's line of argument does not and cannot make sense. It is based upon a philosophy and a logic which are alien to our ways of thought. So this is what I want to just share with you, because here we have the two cultures of fearlessness. So of course, we know of Mahatma Gandhi's fearlessness. But we also know that Winston Churchill himself was a courageous individual. He's seen war himself. But his line of thinking was different to Mahatma Gandhi's line of thinking. Because his line of thinking was, we have force, we must use it. We must use the gun, we must overpower. And he actually coaxed or took England into the war when Neville Chamberlain was a pacifist and was trying to make peace with Hitler. Churchill saw that it was not possible. So this is where again we go back to the righteous battles that we need to have sometimes. But his approach was totally different to Mahatma Gandhi's approach. They didn't understand each other. But then we have other great men who followed Mahatma Gandhi's principles, in Martin Luther King. So Martin Luther King talks about the inspiration for the Selma Walk, for instance, came from the inspiration from the Salt Marches. Martin Luther King also realized that rather than being a pacifist without any action, that we can take action by being a pacifist. And that's what he did. And the United States government really didn't know how to deal with Martin Luther King, because he was not breaking any laws. He was not becoming violent. And Martin Luther King had a hard time keeping other people like Malcolm X, who was attacking him for promoting nonviolence. So he had to also appease his own followers, own supporters, into keeping true to the approach of ahimsa, nonviolence. And then of course Nelson Mandela was inspired by him too, but Nelson Mandela broke the rule of nonviolence because he realized that the apartheid regime in South Africa was so strong that they were just beating them down. And that's when he started the campaign of attacking infrastructure, but it was strict adherence to not harming innocent people. And if you look at what's going on today in the world in terms of harming innocent people in the wars that we're seeing right now, that's not sacred anymore. So Mandela took it to that level, and the South African government realized that they also have to now come to terms with that too. That ANC was now fighting back too. But it was the principal battle. So if you look at the mental, cultural and the ideological divide that continued on and continues from back then, and I want to trace it back to how it all started, perhaps, is so it's about absolutism, right? We know for a fact that this is what we can do and we get it done. And it's hard-nosed, it's black and white, it's brute force, it's indulgence in that brute force. As opposed to, on the other side is resistance. Other side is non-violent and restraint, and it's gray, and there are nuances there are subtleties there. So what the mindfulness and the meditation practice does is, and I know from personal practice, is that the violence that I had in my body, in my mind, and I must say, when I landed in Canada in 1973 as a 14-year-old, the first day I went to school, junior high school, and I came out, I was beaten up by 3 boys on the street. And I was told, Packy, go home, basically, right? And I didn't even understand the word, what it meant. But my whole world fell apart because I'm the one who forced my parents to come to Canada at that time. They were quite well off there, they were middle class there. My parents had mercantile families to support them. So now my whole world fell apart that day, 1974 that was, in April. And because I played sports, I was strong, I became a very nasty kid. I started getting into all kinds of fights there and creating trouble. I get off a bus actually, and if I see a young man alone standing waiting for the bus, I elbow them as they walk past them. And I try to create a fight there. So I got into all kinds of trouble there because everything became black and white for me. Everything became scary for me. But one of the things that I must say that Canada gave me, and that's one of the reasons that I think all of us are here, and we are differentiating ourselves from what's happening below the border, is that in school too, one day, as I was walking to a class, same thing happened to me. A bunch of boys standing in line to go to a shop class said the same words to me. And this time I went with my elbow and I knocked this guy to the ground. And if you've been to the high schools and the lockers, they make a lot of noise. Bang! This guy fell, and the teacher came running out, grabbed me by my neck, and said, "You're going to the principal's office." And I was one of the few South Asians in the school at the time. And I thought, oh my gosh, not only the students, not only the streets, the institutions are racist too, I thought. And he dragged me, he was holding me by my neck and dragging me to the principal's office. I managed to tell him just before we got into the principal's office that boy called me a Packy. And he immediately dropped his hand. He said, "Turn around and follow me." I was confused. I didn't know now where are we going. And he was now going back towards those boys. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, now what's happening now? And he went up to this boy and he said, "Apologize." That's when I realized that the institutions in Canada were at least protecting me. And so those are some of the examples, and then gave me a sense of safety there, at least within the school system. And I got involved with multicultural associations there in Scarborough there. The mayor was quite keen because now racism against South Asians became rampant in the 70s because of Idi Amin expelling the Indian population in the 1970s. So suddenly it ramped up in Toronto. So a lot more attacks started happening there. So we got together as young people and started creating communities to create understanding amongst each other. And we were supported politically too. Luckily, people like Premier Bill Davis, Roy McMurtry, who was the Attorney General at the time, took it upon themselves to also create some laws against discrimination and created the Human Rights Commission in Toronto. So there were lots of things that happened in our favor to protect us with laws and regulations. And then, of course, 1982, Pierre Trudeau deemed Canada a multicultural nation in the Constitution. So all our, protections that are here as a result of these kinds of actions by people like Roy McMurtry. But one of the things that I must say, Roy McMurtry giving a speech one day at a community gathering, he said, no law, no rule, no regulation, no legislation can make one person love their neighbor. It has to happen from the heart, he said. He said, yes, the laws are there as a guide, but we have to create a society that is open-minded and loving and kind to each other. So in terms of the gray and nonviolence and restraint, that's the kind of society that will thrive at the end of the day, flourish at the end of the day, right? And for me, the mindfulness meditation practice over the years, what it did was to move my mind towards restraint and constraint, rather than indulging on the other side. The other side, so yes, I had the power, I had the muscles at the time to fight and do all that, but then I was luckily also taken to a Kung Fu dojo at the time by somebody, by a friend of mine, by a mentor called Terry Subu, because he would save me once in a while from a fight, which I couldn't handle. And in that Kung Fu dojo, on the first day, I was given a boxing glove, and there were 11 people there, and they had 10 seconds with me in the initiation. Now I'm a 15-year-old kid, right? And I couldn't even walk after the third person came at me. But before starting the session after that, he sat us all down and he guided us through a meditation. And I was wondering, what does fighting have to do with meditation? His answer was, meditation is what will help you restrain yourself. You have now, you're going to get the skills, because this program was based on Bruce Lee's Kung Fu, and I learned skills to virtually be able to kill somebody. He said, now the meditation practice is there then to temper the power that you're going to gain from learning these techniques. So this is where I really feel that mindfulness, the mindfulness movement that is now taking root in the world, is going to help us. It's going to give us hope, like you said, in changing away from brute force and the violence onto the other side. So what is the emotional divide too? And then here, on the other side is fear, greed, hatred, and delusion. And then on the right side is love, compassion, empathy, truth, beauty, and goodness. How do we work towards the right side? And I will introduce you to some of the latest neuroscience about the left and right hemisphere too as we go on. It was being looked upon as pop psychology before, but there is now so much of work that's going on in terms of being able to isolate the left and the right hemisphere of the brain. So at the end of the day, if we can also realize that there's a physiological process that can also help us to become more mindful and aware and loving and kind and get to the side of truth, beauty, and goodness, then that's the exciting part in terms of marrying the ancient practices of mindfulness with the modern neuroscience that are now showing us the way to get to the other side, which is also advocating mindfulness. So in terms of what's being conditioned to us, Marshall Rosenberg was also inspired by Mahatma Gandhi. Anybody heard of, how many of you have heard of nonviolent communications? Yes. So NVC is a practice, but it's a movement too, as you know. And I was taught NVC in Sri Lanka in the middle of the war by a wonderful person called Ms. Jayanti. And it's a very simple practice. And I will also introduce part of that practice as we go on today. And I worked a lot with the education community of the Tamil population who was caught up in the war, and the Sinhala and the Muslim population in the schools in those areas using NVC techniques. So what he said is most of us have been educated from birth to compete, judge, demand, and diagnose. So that's that logical, rational, reductionist process, right? In terms of what's right and wrong. And that's what leads to the violence. And the violence first is happening in our minds, isn't it? And how do we overcome that? And this is what the practice that he inspired, because he grew up as a Jewish kid in California and he was discriminated against. And when he was telling his stories, when you read his stories, I could empathize with him from the kind of thing that happened to me too. So, but as you all know, there's hope. So on one side too, we also love the anchors of certainty. And that certainly comes from individualism, but it is also fear-based. But when in real life everything is uncertain, but at the same time when we create community, and to do that it takes courage. So this is where I believe that we have to have the courage, and we get inspired by people like Mahatma Gandhi, who was courageous in facing a daunting enemy in terms of the colonial structures that were continuing to subjugate India at the time. Okay? So I want to go back in history a little bit. Does anybody have any comments or questions?
Not
Thoughts?
question, it make, I think you can hear me. I don't want to use this.
Oh, sure.
Thank you. It makes sense what you say. See, there is so much of power in the world, right? So when there is power, there is fear too, lots of fear. And I know that I am one of them. I have lots of fears. It paralyzes us when you have fear. So Mahatma Gandhi, he talks about this non-violent communication, right? Non-violence. Why? Because it's that help individually. He's asking all of us, practice this non-violence in our life. And then as you say, mindfulness helps us also to control that violence, right? So it makes sense that our responsibility, each one of us, we need to start with ourselves. This is what for me constantly, I also belong to an organization called Initiatives of Change. Instead of blaming others, start with yourself. Because we want to judge others and we make all these accusations, and we never see that all those things are within us. So it makes sense, how when we get out of this fear, then you get the courage, and then you have a love for each other, and you think about the humanity. So it makes sense. So you summarize the whole thing, and finally it is our responsibility for each one of us. We need to examine ourselves before blaming other people. What am I doing? What am I doing? So it's Gandhi's, it is responsibility, each one of our responsibilities. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. So I want to now take us back down the historical road to see why we are in this predicament that we are in today, in terms of how has this happened, why is it happening, and when we ask the question why, we can get to a root cause. Because when we understand the root causes of why we may be facing the situations that we're facing based on the ideologies and the conditioning that we've had, and that's what I want to share right now. And those foundations of separation started with, I believe, with Descartes, yes. About 15, 20 minutes ago, yes. So foundations happened with Descartes. I think therefore I am. He separated the mind and the body. Separating of the mind and the body is what we are seeing right now, because what was told to us as human beings was that the mind is in control of the body. And the power then also transferred to the human being at the top of the food chain, that we can control nature. We can control, we can subjugate nature. And that separated us from the notion of I'm one with nature. I'm separate from nature because I have power over nature. And Bacon, Francis Bacon, whose sciences that we are using right now for our material world, but he did also say that science and inventions exert a gentle guidance over nature's course. They have the power to conquer and subdue her. And that's what we're seeing continuing right now, even 500-600 years later. And that's what we have to then realize. So the mind and the body is separated here. So we look at how we can bring that together, right? And the machine age is what changed everything in terms of tick-tock, right? And when the clock was discovered, then conformity, uniformity, regimentation, which is totally outside the human being's need for free will. It all changed in the name of science. So people like Galileo, Copernicus, they all brought on certain scientific truths they were, but they also then gave an opportunity for us to create technologies to control nature, so to speak, to give us as human beings a comfortable life. And yes, we all enjoy this comfortable life, but at what cost? And then, of course, the colonization started with the gun. There's a book by a woman called Priya Satriya called The Empire of Guns. A fascinating book about how the gun is what then enabled us to the Europeans to conquer the rest of the world, because it was a technology that then enabled to easily get rid of a person. Right? So I can just imagine. I've heard a story of in Sri Lanka how when the Portuguese first came and when the Sri Lankans tried to get aggressive with them, one person was standing here, the next thing you know, the other person was on the ground bleeding, killed by a stick. Was the story that came. So immediately the native population thought and saw that, wow, there's magic that these Western human beings are bringing to our part of the world. So we have to now subjugate ourselves to that, is what essentially started happening, right? So in terms of giving up on the freedoms of these countries happened as a result of that. So I'm not making a judgment of any of these things in that sense that those are times, that's what happened. But to understand that history is important for us, because even the sale of the guns that happened from England started from a family called Galtons, who was supplying the British East India Company. And Galtons came from a Quaker family. And we know that the Quaker families are for peace, love, and care. So he broke the rules in the name of the empire, and he was also ostracized by the Quakers, other Quakers in Birmingham, for producing and selling guns. But he continued to do so. So all of these histories are important for us to understand, to put things in context. And then in the United States of America, after the immigration, the great migrations from Europe, for the Europeans to run away from tyranny of the church and also of monarchs, came to the United States of America, and they used their ingenuity in terms of building, for instance, making steel in a different way, in more innovative ways, for instance, in Pennsylvania, and started the whole notion of the consumer culture to meet beyond the needs. How can we create wants? And this is known. This person is known as the father of PR. He is Sigmund Freud's nephew, Ed Bernays. And he wrote a book, and this is what he said in the early 1900s. Conscious and intelligent manipulation of organized habits and opinions of the masses, an important element in democratic society. So now with AI, can you imagine what's happening to us in terms of the potential manipulation of our minds using these technologies that he started. He worked with various consumerist organizations. He's the one who promoted cigarettes for women. He said he hid the fact that there were negative effects from cigarettes and perpetuated that story so he can create a consumer culture for something as harmful as a cigarette. So this is what we have to see, but we also see that a lot of the things that we are enjoying right now in terms of the heat, in terms of the conveniences we have, all of the things that we feel that we cannot do without, it also came from that culture of technology and development, right? So we have to put all of that in perspective. And how do we find middle ground? But at the same time, the enlightenment that happened, that period that happened in the late 1800s, that created the technology world, the modern techno-industrial complex as we see it. Now the question is, was it at the cost of our morality? And did it bring the selfish individualism that we are seeing right now? And is it robbing us of our meaning and purpose? Is it creating this kind of cultural imperialism which is now technology based and which is losing our humanity? Is that what's happening right now? So understanding and knowing this then enables us to, how do we push back? How do we bring our humanity back, knowing the strong forces that are coming at us? And then that also comes to the folly of certainty, absolutism. And we also realize that there's radical uncertainty that is now acknowledged even in the world of economics now, because economics has been a science that gives us as consumers a notion that things are under control. Oh, don't worry, we will bring the interest rates down and the inflation levels will go down at the same time, and all of those certainties that we thought were there are really not certainties. And now economists are also acknowledging the fact that we have what they're terming as wicked problems that we have absolutely no control over. So this is the reality right now. And even somebody as genial as Margaret Atwood, the Canadian author, talks about vampires, aristocrats and landowners with fancy outfits and capes, and the Frankenstein monster is a creature of enlightenment. So when you think about the technologies that are now coming at us, is it a Frankenstein that we have created right now? And these are questions that we have to ask ourselves. And in terms of Gandhi, who discovered the Bhagavad Gita while he was studying in England, this is what he's quoted. If one ponders on the objects of sense, in his autobiography, it's there. There springs attraction. From attraction grows desire. Desire flames the fierce passion. Passion breeds recklessness, and then the memory of all betrayed. Let noble purpose go and saps the mind till purpose mind and man are all undone. So there's warnings from the top that came in the United States too. As General Eisenhower, the President Eisenhower gave up his office in 1961, he warned us against a military-industrial complex. And in 2025, as Biden left office, this is what he said. He warned us of the oligarchy. So these are people in power who have seen it from the inside of the dangers of the culture that we have created through the military techno-industrial complex. So it's a daunting situation that we're facing right now when you think about it. And then add to that the limited liability corporation is where you can hide behind, because a limited liability corporation creates us an entity as a human person who can lobby, who can do things, except for it is in perpetuity. It's not born, it doesn't die. It can carry on continuously. And it's inanimate, and its sole purpose is profit. Right? So these are the institutions that govern us, that are around us, that when we become aware of them, then we can slowly chip away at that. Because this law has not been changed since the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, created it, and the British East India Company created it. And it protects us. I've had a limited liability corporation since I was 25 years old. And I know the privileges I have with that corporation in terms of hiding my profits, in terms of doing so many things to lobby governments and even to bribe politicians to get my way. illegitimate ways by hiding behind a limited liability license. So this is important for us to know. Sorry, I'm gonna see whether I can go through fast in the next slides now and get to the end of this. So what we have is narcissists, right? A delusion, captivated by their own impermanent nature. So we are optimistic that the East and West, that seeming divide of the East and West is not permanent, that we can change that our common humanity is there. This 500 years, 600 years of the separation of the mind and the body is an aberration, that when we understand it, we can work to assimilate the East and the West. So let me just use this then. And we know also from indigenous cultures that are now being more and more honored. We started off, Anilji started off with the acknowledgement of the unceded lands that we are standing on here. And so this is the hierarchical way of looking at it from a Maslow's hierarchy of need. But Maslow actually got his first learning from a Blackfoot community in the United States. And they start with self-actualization first. They say in the indigenous culture, when the baby is born, the baby is already self-actualized. There's no hierarchy that's needed. So honoring that child from birth as a part of that process is then how we create a society that is thriving and flourishing with love and kindness. And in indigenous cultures, they created a circle. Cognitive, spiritual, emotional. So it's not a hierarchy. It's a circle. And how do we link that now to also the modern neuroscience? And then, of course, Mahatma Gandhi talked about trusteeship, influenced the business leaders like Jamshedji Tata to create a company, an organization where 66% of the Tata company is owned by a Tata Trust and only 44% is owned by private entities, including the family, right? So he influenced business leaders to move away from the profit-only mindset, and these are some of his. Oh, I'm sorry, it's not coming through properly with they're not aligned properly. So he talked about the nature of fear, overcoming fear, moral integrity, and grounding ourselves on spiritual growth. And so there are important lessons there for us. And then John Milton, the mind is in its own place and it can make heaven or hell out of, or heaven of hell or hell of heaven. So it's really up to us, as Mangalam said too, going within us to be able to change the way we look at the world, the way we look at how we show up in the world, the way we work with each other, the way we live with each other, the way we love each other, and then to realize that at the end of the day, this body that we have is a fleeting body. At the end of the day, I don't own it. I'll be born into it, and then I will disappear one day. And being attached to it is what brings us suffering. So in terms of non-self, the awareness of self is not the self. This pure consciousness isn't a self. It's not a person. It's that attachment to that person that creates most of the problems. So I go back just to remind us of the process of right effort, right mindfulness, so we have right understanding. And in the meditation practice, the divided brain comes together with the prana, right? With chi. As soon as I take a breath, what I do is I connect the mind and the body together. I align the mind and the body together where we have the most amount of clarity, most amount of power. Our action can come from there. So this is where, in terms of what Mahatma Gandhi also said, that his grounding came from his daily practice. This is where I encourage all of us to have a daily practice of mindfulness where we can then ground ourselves on a daily basis so we can become fearless, we can acknowledge the truth and become fearless through that process. And now I just want to cover a few things about the modern neuroscience before in the next 10 minutes or so. And Jill Taylor is a Harvard neuroscientist who had a stroke when she was 37 years old. It was a congenital problem. And she has a TED talk called My Stroke of Insight, for those of you who want to check her out. And she wrote her latest book called Whole Brain Living. So she talks about peace is only a thought away, and we have to access it, to silence the mind. So she focuses her attention on the breath in terms of bringing the mind together using the power of the breath. And in terms of fearlessness, she talks about the left hemisphere has been trained to perceive myself as a solid separate from others, and the right hemisphere relishes in the eternal flow. It's no longer isolated and alone. My soul is as big as the universe and frolics with glee in a boundless sea. So we're starting to now talk about the notion that most of us who have grown up in the urban world are stuck in the left hemisphere of the brain based on fear, based on ideology, self-serving, selfish, individualistic, and all of that is the result of us being stuck on the left hemisphere of the brain because of the challenges that the world is throwing at us. And now they talk about, and then now this is Dr. Ian McGilchrist talks about the left and the right hemisphere along the same lines. And I want to play a quick video of his just to give you a little bit more information on it. So again, what he also talks about is the fact that we can transcend the left hemisphere of the brain and become whole brain, and mindfulness meditation is one way of doing it, to become fearless and open-minded. So I'm going to just take a moment and show you a quick video. Put the microphone here so.
I recall reading in your book that attention isn't an act of cognition.
Yes. I didn't altogether understand the importance of attention when I first discovered that it was different in the two hemispheres. I thought, well, gosh, that is interesting. And I wasn't even looking for it. I just happened to be very interested in attention at one point. So I read all the material I could, and it clearly emerged that there was a difference in the way the two hemispheres attended. And from that, of course, many things followed. But at the time, being rather used to the normal sort of cognitivist way of thinking, I just thought of attention as another function of the brain. You know, this is the trouble with the machine model, actually. Because a machine can't attend. A machine can be set a problem, but it can't dispose its attention. Because attention is the way in which you dispose your consciousness towards the world. Consciousness is always towards or of something. Consciousness can't not have a goal or an aim or an object or a concern. So the way in which you dispose your consciousness towards the world is what we call attention. If I dispose my consciousness in a very narrow way, which breaks up the field of reality into small disks, which then appear to be fragments, which the brain then has to assemble in order to understand, then you see a different world from the world that you see if the way you dispose your consciousness is maximally broad, rather as in certain kinds of meditative practice in which you try to just take in as much as possible of what is going on around you without forming any judgment upon it. In other words, not setting the talkative part of the mind, basically the left hemisphere conscious cognition, not setting that going. And that in the Buddhist tradition is known as monkey mind, because it's jabbering and it's all over the place. Stilling that enables one to see more. What is also fascinating is that there is an exercise which I have done and which I like very much, which is to try to dispose your consciousness in a highly focused way and a highly broadened and extended way at the same time. And of course that is exactly why we have two hemispheres. You can't possibly do that with one hemisphere, because one arising center of consciousness can only be disposed one way. That's why we have two, so that we can dispose them differently.
So do you feel that such an exercise might be a way of balancing the hemispheres?
It is a way. I mean, in terms of EEG, electrophysiological record, it is a way in which one can correct the usual slight preponderance of left hemisphere over right, and equalize it. And in many meditative practices, it particularly engages the right hemisphere. And the experienced meditators, there are findings, both functional findings about how the right hemisphere is functioning in such subjects, but also anatomical findings that certain areas of the right hemisphere that are particularly important for it become enlarged or thicker than they would otherwise be. So it certainly is a matter of engaging the right hemisphere and also the left. It plays a role.
It's really interesting. I remember doing a meditative exercise in Aikido actually many years ago, and you'd start off by centering just below the navel,
Right.
Gandhian, I think the Chinese call it, and on a very small point,
Yes.
as tiny as you can imagine, and then bit by bit this point would enlarge
Right.
and encompass you, and then encompass everything in the universe, and so you go from one,
Yes.
it's just expanding this out. So
Yes.
maybe that was a similar thing.
So you see that now modern neuroscience is acknowledging the importance of meditation and the focus on the breath, because breath is, for me, that's been a mission to help people to make the breath the best friend, because it's a life force that we forget, we take for granted. But when we focus on the breath, it becomes a tremendous power to us to find our grounding, to become fearless. Then becomes much easier when we focus on the breath. And here, basically, what Ian McGilchrist says is that the left hemisphere is concerned with the manipulation of the world, tends to see things as isolated and fragmentary, and there's a certainty to it. Whereas on the right hemisphere, you put things in perspective by opening them up to the possibilities, looking at the world in a holistic way, and that you understand the world with empathy and compassion. So it's really exciting when neuroscience is showing this. So I want to share with you a simple little exercise that you could try to understand how your feelings and realize what's arising in you by acknowledging the fact that an emotion is essentially a feeling that arises when a need is met or not met. So if there's a feeling of fear, it may be that a feeling of fear arising in me. It may be my need for safety is not there. That's why I'm afraid. So when we make that correlation in a logical, rational way, we can take it deep down into figure out what is causing that feeling that I'm right now being messed about by. Right? So these are general feelings and needs that we have. I just quickly share that with you. And I have a simple practice that I want to share with you before we end. And I call it 4 questions for clarity. So the first thing that when I shared with you, breathe and observe, was that first part of that process. When you take a breath and say observe to yourself, you stop that thought process. And then once I stop the thought process, I can then ask myself, what am I feeling right now? Because for most of us, we have a general sort of because we live in a competitive, difficult world, a sense of anxiety, a slow burning of anxiety that happens, that we allow and enable, and it continues on. and if you don't address them, that's what takes us to the place of fear, and it keeps us compromised. It doesn't allow us to take action with confidence and courage. So once I ask, what am I feeling? If I can ask myself, why am I feeling that way? I can get down to the level of, okay, what am I needing right now? As soon as I shine a light on what am I feeling and needing, I take the power away from it messing me up. So it's a simple little exercise, and I'm happy to share that with you. I'll share it with Anilji also. You can share it with the community. A simple little practice, and that way we can. It's a meditative exercise which I use constantly to unpack my emotions, to stay grounded and stay clear as best as I can, to deal with the challenges that I face on a day-to-day basis. So in terms of mindfulness, the virtual mindfulness of wisdom are supported by 3 fundamental functions of the brain to regulate. The brain regulates itself, and then this is how we can move away from materialism. And then Thich Nhat Hanh talked about this, but then what I want to finish up with is, I'm going too fast with this, what I want to finish up with this is the fact that understanding that we don't have to divide ourselves in terms of East or West or cultural ideologies. We have a common humanity. And Rabindranath Tagore had lots of sessions with Einstein, and this is what he came up with in terms of the conversations. But now the thing is, now these conversations happened 60, 70, about 80 years ago, 70 years ago, right? 60 years ago. But we still haven't figured it out yet. I think we have no choice now but to come together in our common humanity. And Rajiv Kipling's story on common humanity came through his beautiful ballad of the East and the West, which is often misunderstood, but it is about the East and West coming together in understanding each other's cultures, cultural nuances, and to find that common humanity. And I want to give the final word to Gandhiji. We must cultivate inner strength and courage to live according to ethical principles and moral integrity. This leads to fearlessness, essential for individuals and communities to resist oppression and achieve social change. So I really hope and trust that I took you on a little bit of a trip today to go from the individual to the world, look at the history, look at philosophy, look at science, and then come back to the individual so we can have that individual practice to stay grounded, spiritually grounded, so we can be fearless in facing the predicaments that are coming at us. So thank you very much for your patience, and